I found the envelope on a Tuesday morning, the kind of thin cream paper you only ever saw at wedding venues or private clubs. It sat on my kitchen island like a small, dangerous promise. Rain had been on and off all week in Seattle, flat gray light that made the countertops look like river stone, and my coffee had gone cold in the mug beside it. For a moment, I convinced myself it was a menu, a flyer, something that wouldn't require me to breathe slower. The name on the front was embossed in a language of curls, Belvedere Hall. My thumb hovered above the flap, and I realized I didn't remember ordering anything from a place like that. I opened it because I was the kind of person who opened things, who wanted to know rather than guess, who read the fine print even when it hurt. Inside was a contract, weighty, formal, and a deposit invoice for $76,400. The event, a Saturday reception the next summer. The signature at the bottom was mine, or a convincing mimicry of it. The address listed my childhood home in Bellevue, and the phone number had a name attached in small type, Brooke Parker. My hands went cold. The kitchen hummed around me. The refrigerator, the rain sliding down the window, the distant thump of a train. My heart made a slow, stubborn drumbeat against my ribs. I read the total again. $76,400. The numbers were too precise to ignore. I had not signed any contract. I had not planned a wedding. I had not given anyone permission to book my name or my credit. Brooke, my sister, my twin in everything except the script we had been given by our parents, had been the only person I could think of who would know how to ink my full name with that sly flourish. She had always loved theater, loved being in other people's stories. She liked the idea of glamour. The first time I had lent her money, I believed I was helping. It was a gray winter 3 years earlier, when her barista job didn't stretch to cover a security deposit for an apartment she had to take to be near an internship. She called me at midnight, voice raw with panic, and I wired $200 from my Harbor Bank checking. I told myself it was a loan. She'd pay me back. Later, I paid a late fee on her credit card once when she couldn't, then covered a small medical bill after a reckless scooter accident. I filled our kitchen with receipts in those months, stacking them like protective tiles between us and some harsher truth. We had always been the family who borrowed from our own. Memory arrived in vignettes. Me at 23. Taking a second shift at a design firm to make rent. Mom, Karen, leaning over our dinner table telling stories that dissolved into thinly veiled complaints about money. Dad, Michael, calm and immovable, telling me to keep my head down and work harder. Loans felt like love in our family. Favors were currency. I sat down with the contract on my lap and let the cold seep into the bones of my hands. I called Brooke. "Hey," she answered, like I'd expected. It was early, but her voice was already minted with that lighter register she reserved for casual catastrophes. "Did you book something at Belvedere Hall?" I kept my voice even. A laugh. Too quick. "What? No. Why would I book your wedding?" "You signed something with my name on it." The silence that followed felt small and brittle. "Olivia, come on. You know I wouldn't—" But she had. Not directly, perhaps. She had become practiced at sliding things into motion without telling me, at making decisions that felt like inevitabilities to everyone else, but that left me holding the bill later. When I asked her who'd authorized my name on the contract, she said she wasn't going to pay, that it was just a hold, that she had meant to tell me but hadn't had the chance, that she would figure it out. A couple of plates of hospital-grade excuses had always been how she worked. Charm, a tilt of eyes, the quick pivot to, "I'll make it up to you." But charm didn't cover signatures, and a hold didn't explain a legal contract. I made a list. I always made lists when my head felt like a spinning coin. The list became a creed. Bank accounts to check, credit card statements to pull, emails to comb through, texts to resurrect. I had an old spreadsheet habit from my days in project management, rows and columns as truth-tellers. I opened a blank sheet and wrote, in a neat professional font, "Family Loans, Olivia Parker." Then I began to fill it as if assembling a small courtroom. Family loans, Olivia Parker. Date, to, amount, purpose, notes. 2019-11-08. Brooke Parker, 1-200. Security deposit for 2BR Appdieter, Renton. Wire from Harbor Checking. 2020-04-15. Ryan Parker. $600 car insurance payment. Reimbursed in cash. Partial. 2021-07-09. Brooke Parker. 3,400. Credit card payoff. Recurrent monthly transfers noted. 2022-09-12. Michael Parker, dad. $5,000. Home repair loan. Written IOU, handwritten. 2023-02-02. Unrecognized. $76,400. Belvedere Hall deposit. Contract signed. Dispute pending. The numbers accumulated like small accusing ornaments on a tree. $42,000 total in loans to family over the last 5 years, all of them small enough to be rationalized, large enough to leave a bruise. The $76,400 was an outlier, a red eclipse. I started with the obvious. I called Harbor Bank. They put me on hold for long, breathless minutes during which a woman at a call center in Spokane must have pulled up my transactions and scrolled through a ledger I didn't know I'd been part of. The customer service rep told me what I feared. The deposit had indeed been authorized with my card number and an email address tied to me. There was a record of a verification code sent to an email account I hadn't used in years, one I'd created for a newsletter when I freelanced design work, and then abandoned. "You need to file a fraud claim," the rep said. "We can start an investigation, but transfers like that can be difficult if it looks like the information was voluntary." "Voluntary?" I said. "I didn't sign anything." She was empathetic in the measured cadence of policy. "We will block charges pending an investigation, but if the contract is signed with a matching signature, that complicates things. Often the venue will require ID. Belvedere Hall was not obligated to return the deposit until other conditions were met. They had a contract in hand that looked real. I felt my lungs compress as if someone had wrapped them in twine. The rain outside began a steady curtain of water. I went into the old email account. There, hiding amidst marketing emails and a decade of abandoned subscriptions, was a thread. Correspondence between Belvedere Hall and an Olivia Parker with a different email domain. It included the signed contract, a scanned driver's license number that matched my own in thumbnail size, and payment details. Someone had gone to lengths to fabricate the digital paper trail. I called Brooke again, trying a different tack. "Did you ever use my old Gmail? Did you ever?" Her voice opened warm and then closed. "Olivia, I told you. I didn't mean for it to be, you used my name, you used my ID. I needed to hold the date, people were trying to book it." "What for?" I asked. "Whose wedding?" Her laugh was small and sharp. "Not a wedding for us, a client booking. You know, a big thing. I thought you'd be okay with it. It's not like we're stealing from you." We argued until my throat felt raw. She painted the scene with broad strokes. An emergency booking, a client who guaranteed reimbursement, a promise that she'd arrange for the money to be moved into my account before any charge took effect. She said "we," as if I had been consulted in the planning. She said "family," as if that entitled her to use me as a pass-through. When the conversation ended, there was an ache I knew intimately, an old familiar fissure where trust had been chipped away by one small favor at a time. It had taken years to get to this, a pattern of borrowing that had been reacquainted with itself until it resembled normalcy. I began collecting evidence with the clinical obsession of someone who preferred facts to feelings. I printed bank statements, highlighted transactions, took screenshots of emails, and saved them into a folder labeled Belvedere Dispute. I documented the dates with clinical precision. January 12th, Harbor Bank, recurring transfer $500 to Brooke Parker noted. April 2nd, Harbor Bank, ACH to Belvedere Hall, $5,000, reversed. June 6th, credit card payment, $3,400 to B. Parker, Arm Square. The numbers made a cold kind of sense. Patterns emerged. Weekly transfers that coincided with rent due dates, larger transfers just before family events. round sums that could not be explained by groceries or borrowed gas. I saw, in columns and cells, a ledger of obligation masquerading as affection. I met with a friend, Maya Chen, who worked in fraud analysis for a mid-sized fintech. Over greasy tacos in Capitol Hill, she took one look at my folder and said, "This is textbook family-run siphoning. People do this all the time. The trick is they keep amounts small so no one raises an eyebrow until it's structurally entrenched." "How do I make them raise their eyebrow?" I asked. "Documentation," Maya said. "Paper trail, dates, the bank reports you already have. Then you ask for an auditor or a legal consult. The more formal you make it, the less optional repayment becomes. You also make sure the venue knows you've disputed authorization." I followed Maya's steps. I filed a claim with Harbor Bank's fraud department. I emailed Belvedere Hall's event manager, Ms. Larkin, explaining that the signature and ID were not mine and that I had disputed the authorization. Her reply was careful, professional, and not immediately helpful. We required ID for contract changes. Deposits were non-refundable within 45 days of event date. The date listed on their calendar was more than a year away. The deposit had been made within a toss of time that might still allow for clarity. "We can place a hold," she wrote, "pending verification." My life felt like a house strung between two storms, the bureaucratic one of banks and contracts and the familial one. Waves of guilt, anger, shame, crashing inside the rooms. The first therapy session came not out of desperation, though I hovered near that on more than one night, but out of a pragmatic desire to have a witness who wasn't emotionally involved. Dr. Harris was in a compact office that smelled faintly of citrus and antiseptic. His chair was tall and plump. His questions were patient. "Tell me what you want," he said, and I did. I told him about the contract, about the list, about the spreadsheet with dates and amounts, and my slow, dawning terror. I told him about the first $200, about the $3,400, about the way my family phrased favors as obligations they could impose. He listened without flinching, and when I stopped, he said, "Boundaries are a muscle. You grow them by practicing small no's. The first no is the hardest. Each one after that gets easier. But it's not about being rigid. It's about safety." I repeated the phrase later in the solitude of my car on a rain-splashed street. The first no is the hardest. It felt like a mantra I could use to shape my mouth around new syllables. Work offered me a brittle way to hold myself together. I had been an interior designer for a boutique firm, Harbor and Thread, for 7 years, drafting kitchen elevations and selecting brass finishes. The job was a stable, measured thing in my life. Client calls, mood boards, phone interviews. When a recruiter from Charleston Home and Design reached out, fishing for a creative director to lead an upcoming showroom redesign, I surprised myself by accepting a phone interview. It was a pivot across coasts, an escape route that smelled of magnolias and salt air rather than pine and drizzle. The recruiter, Jenna, was all Southern hospitality and a New York accent. "We loved your portfolio," she said. "We think you'd be perfect to lead a small team to reimagine our Charleston showroom. Big, residential scale clients. It's a leadership role, Olivia." "What's the compensation package?" I asked. Numbers kept my panic at bay. She gave me a range: salary, equity in design projects, a relocation stipend just shy of $12,000. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was honest, steady, a way to manufacture distance. I decided to apply. The interview was a wake-up. Crisp questions, situational design problems, talk about team growth. When the hiring manager, Ethan, asked why I wanted to move across the country, I told him truthfully, for a new start, to take control of my life. On paper, it sounded like work rhetoric. In my chest, it felt like something else. A small beacon that cut through the gray. Back home, the situation with Belvedere Hall intensified. Belvedere's legal team required copies of IDs and a notarized statement. If I wanted to dispute the signature, Harbor Bank wanted me to file a police report for identity theft. My city precinct was sympathetic but slow. They gave me a number and asked me to wait. Family gatherings became mines. On a Sunday afternoon, the four of us sat at the same oak table I had washed my childhood cereal from for years. Karen had set out lemon bars. Michael read the paper in a way that suggested the world was still in order. Brooke arrived with an eyes-wide contrition that looked almost practiced. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," she said before I could begin. Brooke had a way of minimizing like an art form. Light-handed, precise. "Belvedere is just a hold. I talk to them all the time. I'll tell them it's a mistake." "Who else knew about this booking?" I asked. The question felt clinical but necessary. Brooke's face hardened. Nobody needed to know. "That's the whole problem," I said. "You used my name?" Karen intervened in a voice honeyed with shame. Not for Brooke, but for me. "Olivia, darling, we've all had to make tough choices." Brooke was trying to help bring in work. "You make things difficult when you document everything." Her smile said I was the unreasonable one. Michael's voice, when he spoke, was like a door closing gently. "Olivia, family helps family. We don't air our laundry." That phrase, "don't air our laundry," had always been the family's default. Keep matters private, preserve appearances. It was a polite way to suggest you swallow your losses and keep playing your assigned part. I had wanted them to look at the spreadsheet. I wanted a shared ledger, a communal recognition that favors turned into debts could not be indefinitely repaid with charm. Instead, they watched me like I was the one fraying. I brought proof to the table anyway, printed statements with highlighted amounts, bank transfer receipts, the email thread from Belvedere. The room felt smaller as I laid it out. Brooke leaned in, then recoiled. "You kept these," she said. Her voice was a blend of surprise and accusation. "Yes." I tried to not let anger do the talking. "I kept these because when there's a pattern, it isn't about one $76,000 contract. It's about years of asking and taking. It's about me having to patch everything." Karen's eyes glossed. "You know how hard things were when you were starting out." "I know," I said. "I was the one taking second shifts." "No one said you had to be bully about this," Brooke said. And there it was. The pivot to blame, the old script. You make it sound like robbery when it's help. It was relief, in an odd way, to be given the role. If my family saw me as difficult, it meant I had stepped outside the pattern. It also meant isolation. They titled me, in gentle tones, as unreasonable. Comfort in that family took a particular grammar. Pity flavored with condescension. I took action. Harbor Bank froze the disputed charge, but they still required a police report and an affidavit. I made appointments with an attorney on contingency who specialized in identity fraud. She said the presence of a matching signature made litigation slower and more expensive, but not impossible. "How did they get your driver's license scan?" the attorney asked. "I think Brooke had access to my old files," I said. "Old photos, scanned documents. She's always been able to find things." "She could have forged the signature," the attorney said. "You have options. Civil suit for fraud, criminal complaint for forgery. But the court moves slow. Sometimes the most effective pressure is making it public within family circles. Formal letters, demands. It forces reconciliation, or at least creates a paper trail that tends to make people accountable." I felt lucky to know how to mobilize the system. Many people in my neighborhood and in our community didn't, or felt too ashamed to. My advantage was not moral. It was procedural. It was access to resources and the willingness to use them. As I prepared to leave, the job in Charleston felt less like escape than strategy. The relocation stipend would cover a flight, a down payment on a small place. The role promised structure. It offered distance. Brooke's behavior shifted. She began to apologize in stages, first half-heartedly, then more earnestly, when the bank put stronger holds on transfers she had been doing to cover her own slips. She started transferring smaller amounts back into my account, amounts that seemed like reparations. Some of them were returned in cash envelopes left on my porch. Some were electronic. The tipping point arrived in a phone call that was both petty and monumental. Belvedere Hall's event coordinator told me they had received a call from a major client who claimed the contract had been signed in error and that the deposit could be released if I agreed to be a guarantor on the contract or if I agreed to move the event date. The call contained a name I recognized as a local wedding planner who had worked with Brooke. It all clicked into place. The client booking, the arrangement. Brooke had been trying to monetize her network. She had used my name as a veneer of credibility. The pressure to recoup had led to forgery. I pressed charges. The police took statements. The report was filed as suspected identity theft and forgery. Harbor Bank escalated the claim. Belvedere Hall put the hold on the deposit to avoid taking a legal risk. I felt a small bodily relief at each administrative checkmark. Justice was procedural, messy, slow, but it was a language I could speak. Preparation for the move was practical and ritual. I packed boxes and tossed decades of habits into black trash bags. An old Monopoly set from childhood. A stack of journals where I had written design sketches and failed love letters. I sat with my therapist and repeated the principle he'd given me. The first no is hardest. I practiced saying it into a recorder on my phone, the way an actor might wet their throat before a show. "Olivia," Dr. Harris said in our session before I left, "you can't prepare for everything. Boundaries help. So does being kind to yourself when you fail. Change isn't a straight line." "I'm scared I'll go and she'll keep doing this, new versions of it," I said. "Then the work continues," he said, from a new address. Packing felt like unburdening, and also like leaving a wound unbandaged. I canceled old cards, notified Harbor Bank of a new address, and a desire to freeze automatic transfers to family accounts, unless explicitly authorized. I filed the last of the fraud paperwork. I called my manager at Harbor and Thread and explained the resignation. They were sad, which I appreciated because it meant I hadn't burned all the bridges. The night before the flight, I stood on my old balcony and watched the rain flatten the streetlights into long, trembling rods. It was hard not to imagine Brooke's life continuing with the same small thefts and pleas. It was harder still to imagine speaking to my mother without the tense undercurrent of accusations. I touched the ring I had inherited from my grandmother and felt something like a benediction. Small, ancestral, real. The plane to Charleston felt like a cleansing wind. Landing in the South was disorienting in a pleasant way. The air smelled faintly of magnolia and diesel, sun slanting across low brick buildings. The color palette of the city, the terracotta, the gelid blue of the harbor, felt cinematic and strangely expectant. My new apartment in a converted carriage house had high ceilings and a balcony that looked out over a street where people walked with purposeful ease. I began to breathe differently. Work at Charleston Home and Design was earnest and busy. My colleagues, Ethan, Jenna, and Noor, a project manager with a quick smile, were pragmatic, warm. They asked about my design sensibilities, about my leadership style. I found myself thriving in meetings, sketching layouts, explaining how material choices could anchor a narrative in a client's life. The weight of being myself, rather than the family's ledger keeper, was liberating. Phone calls from home were complicated. Brooke alternated between contrite remorse and indignant minimization. Dad's voice softened in ways that felt like a bribe, softness in exchange for silence. Mom sent teaspoons of affection, pictures of the lemon bars, updates on the dog. When I asked for real accountability, payment plans formalized, counseling, I was given vague promises. I used distance as a means to shape conversation. I agreed to short calls on Sundays, measured and bounded. The fall that followed had an odd momentum. Belvedere Hall's management, after consulting their legal counsel, informed me they'd released the hold on the deposit and rescinded the contract. Apparently, another venue had taken the booking, and the complaint had made them decide the risk was not worth it. Harbor Bank issued a provisional credit for the disputed amount, pending their final investigation. The police contacted me with a progress update. They had traced the scanned ID to a scanner at a small print shop where someone had used a personal email tied to Brooke's social presence to arrange a large print job weeks earlier. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a thread they could pull. The local detective said that family fraud like ours was sadly common and messy, but that they had seen cases resolved when the pattern was clear. and the ledger was public. I never wanted to put my family in jail. I wanted, perhaps selfishly, to be able to sleep without the sense that someone could use my name to buy weddings I did not want. The legal process, its slow, bureaucratic justice, began to work in our favor. Brooke had to meet with a mediator. Harbor Bank required documented proof of permission for any future transfers. The family's deception crumbled not in a single dramatic scene, but in the quiet erosion of excuses. Brooke began to return funds in earnest. $3,000 one week, $2,000 the next. She agreed to attend therapy with me, and Dr. Harris offered to be a bridge for 2 sessions. Though I made it clear I would not be the one to bargain moral restitution for cash. Our interactions were raw and clumsy, full of the language of young adults trying to repair a sibling relationship that had been strained by economic habit. At a small mediation session, with the mediator's clipboard and neutral voice, Brooke finally admitted that she had been overwhelmed. "I thought I could fix it," she said, not sounding theatrical but small in the way that real confession makes you. "I didn't mean to drag you into it." Her voice scratched like a match. The mediator proposed a repayment plan. Brooke agreed. The law hovered like a necessary shadow, a set of parameters to keep the behavior from repeating. The aftermath was not cinematic fireworks. There were no triumphant litigations where she went to jail, and I reclaimed my throne. There were instead small, practical restitutions, formalized loan agreements, scheduled transfers, documented therapy appointments. I felt a kind of exhausted relief, less sweet than victory, more stabilizing. Months later, I stood on a small balcony in Charleston, the first aliveness of being in a new place settling into my bones. The city at dusk was a composition of light and shadow. I could see the harbor, where boats dipped like punctuation. Inside the apartment, my plants had new pots, arranged with a care I had not afforded them in the past. My coffee mug, now a different shape, sat on the table. I had hung a framed print of an old blueprint over the sofa. It was simple, intentional. I thought back to the night the envelope appeared, and the small constellation of shocks that followed. Shock had become investigation. Investigation had become accumulation of evidence. Accumulation seeded a choice to leave. The last stage, a new life, was slow and iterative, built by daily habits and new, firmer boundaries. I kept a digital ledger still, but now it measured different things. Days I didn't check my phone when my mother called. The number of no's I said without guilt, 18 in the last 3 months. The evenings spent with friends who owed me nothing. I had made new friends in Charleston who didn't carry the family grammar. Noor, for instance, had been a surprise friendship. Practical, keen-eyed, someone who loved a good space plan and recognized the value of solid furniture. She joked about my penchant for brass, and I laughed in return. There was one afternoon I remember clearly, months into the new life, when Brooke visited. She had driven down, wanting to check in. We walked slowly along a low river path, the air warm and smudged with late summer sweetgrass. She asked me in a voice that had the shape of apology, "Do you forgive me?" I could see the tremor in her hands, the same hands that had once left envelopes on my porch. I thought of every late-night wire transfer, every dinner when I had picked up the slack, every time I had swallowed pride to keep the family whole. Forgiveness felt like a choice I was allowed to make on my terms, not a requirement to keep the family tidy. "I don't know," I admitted. "Forgiveness isn't a single thing you give someone. It's a process. I'm learning to forgive myself, too, for letting it go on as long as I did." She nodded. "I know I hurt you." "I know." We spoke then of small things, of the enormity of being young and feeling like you could fix everything, of the way our parents still insisted on private laundry. The conversation was honest in a way our old talks had not been, less about defense and more about the scaffolding that had held us in place. I told her about Dr. Harris's maxim. She repeated it like a fragile talisman. "The first no is the hardest," she said, and smiled a little. Sometimes at night, I still checked my old Harbor Bank account online, now more out of habit than suspicion. The balances were steady, the transfers authorized only with my explicit sign-off. The world had not become perfect. People still had needs and made bad choices. But I had built margins around myself, procedural, legal, personal. Boundaries that felt, in the quiet way of their doing, like a map back to self. On my new balcony, with the city laid out like a possibility at my feet, I realized that the last scene of the story was neither retribution nor reconciliation, so complete it hurt. It was the daily assembly of a life I could live without being consumed by the ledger of another. I could choose work that made me feel competent. I slept in an apartment where my money was my own. I had a friend who called me at odd hours to talk about fixtures and nothing else. I had a sister who was becoming someone else, slower to promise, more likely to write things down. I raised my cup to the sliver of moon and thought about boundaries, forgiveness, the ledger that had become a backbone. The city hummed, tolerant and vast. I imagined one day, maybe inviting my family to a small gathering in a home that smelled like my own choices. I imagined conversation that didn't cut into old wounds. I had not remade them in my image. I had not exacted a dramatic revenge. Instead, I had learned to say no, to document, to ask for accountability, and to leave when it became necessary. The last image, soft, unadorned, was simply me leaning on a balcony railing, looking at a horizon that would not collapse under my weight. The rain had stopped. The light held steady. I could see my reflection in the glass, older, perhaps, braver. And for the first time in a long while, I liked what I saw.